Thank you very much. So, hello, I'm Matt Marshall. I'm from Open Lab, and I'm here on behalf of my numerous and illustrious co-authors to present some of the work that we've been doing around accountability and technology in charities. But the first thing I want to talk about is probably my most important finding of all. And this is Mike, and he's one of my collaborators at the charity that I work with. And he says to me one day, Matt, you academics, you always start sentences with the word so. It's like you think you're super important. And ever since he said this, I've never been able to stop noticing it, and it's my job today to pass that curse on to you. So, charities. They play an important role in our society. They attend to duties and matters not attended to by the state sector or the private sector, either because they're not interested or we can't trust them. And in the UK, we've had a decade of austerity under a right-wing Conservative government, which has seen a drastic reduction in government spending and service provision across local government. And charities actually end up doing this service provision on the ground for the local government, stuff like social care, housing, and as we'll see later, youth and play work. And due to this impact that they can have on our lives through these local services and the fact that they're using our money to do them, accountability is really the cornerstone of our relationship with these organisations. But accountability is quite a complex creature, and there are lots of different ways to be accountable to somebody, such as to what extent they can control your practices, demand answers from you, or otherwise instigate you to action. In charities, this is actually even more compounded. We use with the diverse set of stakeholders, and we usually cite the word transparency as a means to produce accountability, and I've seen it sort of mentioned quite a lot at CHI this year, which makes me happy, but this is quite a complicated word. When we talk about transparency, we need to talk about what information is produced, in what manner, for whom, and to whom it's available, and these all play roles in what forms of accountability you generate as an organisation, and actually what forms of accountability are even theoretically possible given your circumstances. So fundamentally, I think transparency is really just concerned with the production of information that supports accountability as an interaction between an organisation, its work, and its stakeholders. We're increasingly seeing that interaction being performed digitally, but all these digital tools are doing is reproducing particular forms of legal accountability that perhaps don't lend themselves to parsing by your average citizen and actually cause quite a lot of headaches for workers on the ground. And that's kind of where I wanted to jump in. And what I want to talk about today is that any system that we design must have a fundamental understanding of some of the ways in which transparency obligations actually manifest themselves in daily workplace practice and therefore support the work involved in becoming transparent and accountable as a charitable organisation. And to do that, I've been working with a small charity in the northeast of England who have actually asked to be de-anonymised for this presentation. So I'm proud to announce that since early 2016, I've been performing an ethnographic study of work practice in a small charity who do youth work known as the Patchwork Project. And I approached Patchwork after a previous interaction with them during another study, and they're pretty typical of your small charity. Their work is incredibly value-driven, they have a very, very visible presence in their community, and quite small annual turnovers when you compare them to the big national charities. And they work in the type of geographic area in the West End of Newcastle that's been hit quite hard by these austerity policies that I mentioned before. And this area is colloquially seen by residents as ignored by even the local government services that remain there. So, Patchwork operate out of two buildings, a street-facing hub and a play centre which they actually acquired during my time there. There's 3 full-time staff, Mike, Andy and Dean, with support from part-time staff Sonia and Lynn. And I've been there for around about 2.5 years now, and I've involved myself with everything from doing the volunteering work to sitting on trustee boards, who are sort of like the boards of directors but not evil of a charity, and also performing the actual accounting work with Lynn in the back. I've spent a disgusting amount of time in that office drinking insane amounts of tea. And obviously this work practice has been focusing around sort of how this charity is reproducing this accountability and transparency that's being imposed on them. And I want to present to you some findings that I have loosely grouped across 3 areas of practice. I want to talk about how they spend money and how this is accounted for internally and on paper. And I want to talk about how work is performed and presented to others, and also this idea of hidden work. This is the work that's required. I like to call it reproductive labour, and what's required to reproduce the charity every day so that they can continue performing the other work that they then have to account for separately. So I'll start with spending. The first thing I noticed was that it was funneled through senior staff members, and they actually managed to achieve this while distributing the labour of purchasing. So one day, Sonia and I were given this task to just go out, get some food in for this barbecue that we were running later, and we were just sort of halfway down the street towards the Asda, which is like the local Walmart, I guess. And Mike comes running up. You've met Mike before, so he comes running up and throws me a debit card and goes, "Here, Matt, take this. Do you know the PIN number?" And I didn't. And I turned to Sonia, and she did. And it turned out that this is actually quite a common practice in this type of charity. So when we were shopping, Sonia later on got quite stressed about there being a lack of sort of cheaper store brand products, and was quite upset that she ended up having to purchase some of the more expensive commercial brands, because she would have to report this back to Mike and hand over the card, and it was actually Mike's money, and they can't be seen to be buying brands as a charity. So we see that this buffer exists, that purchases can be checked for appropriateness, both immediately in the moment, and then there's this permeation of this across the workers, so this wider awareness of what a charity can be seen and can't be seen doing with money. And these internal measures show that a charity can attest to being responsible with money when they're able to present this context, but there's no actual formal recognition of this practice. And it's not that formal practices can't be problematic either. Charities are actually required to have their financial accounts signed off at the end of every year by an accountant. And Mike comes to me one day and he says, "Matt, I'm not happy with the accountants at the moment. They're being deeply problematic." And the reason that they're being problematic is, on one hand, they've upped their service charge quite significantly, and two, they're imposing this expensive commercial accounting software on the charity. And this is a problem not just because of the money, but because Patchwork actually built their own working tools across Excel spreadsheets that actually met their own needs and fit with their own working practices. And what they actually ended up doing in the end was they just ditched the accountant. They actually just said, "Bugger off, we're going with this person." They found a new solo accountant, they checked her credentials, and she came in, used their spreadsheet, and sort of signed off and gave them that sort of tick of approval. And we see these commercial models and these commercial packages being sold and forced and imposed on charities, but they're really being misapplied when they're trying to become transparent, because these methods and metaphors and the languages used in these packages don't quite match or fit to the way that a charity might organise itself on the ground, particularly one involved in frontline service delivery with a very small set of staff. And also I see this layer of sort of two-way accountability, where if your accountants are being problematic, you can just ditch them and find a better one online who matches your work practices just a little bit better. But this imposition of formats, that actually sort of permeates through to the rest of the work practices. And I was taken to the back of the project and shown this enormous filing cabinet full of all this monitoring information. And this is stuff that's required by various legal frameworks that are designed to make you accountable, so that you're not sort of putting people directly into prison by giving them bad advice and stuff like that. And they collect this every time they have a chat, which is quite a lot because they have an open door policy that's used quite a lot. And Mike tells me that he's had some files which haven't actually seen the light of day in around 10 years. And he really wants to emphasise to me the cost of the labour involved in producing all this monitoring material that's designed to sort of produce this transparency and generate this accountability, but this formal process isn't actually looked at. They haven't seen the light of day, and they're not given the opportunity to generate this type of accountability that they want to give and demonstrate their work practices. And we can contrast that with a chat I was having with Dean over a cup of tea, and we were sort of fumbling around personal definitions of accountability. And Dean says that the workers there find their inherent position in the community make them accountable. He tells me, I come from this area, I live in the same area as these people, they're watching me constantly, which is quite a weird quote to just have up on a screen. But and he has this awareness, and he's not Dean the youth worker during the day and Dean the darts player down the pub at night. He's one and the same, and his accountability is lived in each and every moment, and it's imbued by the context of his work and his identity, and this he prefers to be seen holistically. But this context is lost even when you co-construct this lens to send out into the world from afar. You have to be there. And this context is fundamental to all of the discussions of their work practices. Patchwork actually acquired a play centre whilst during my time there, a second building, and this was in response to community needs. So it was a play centre which had been abandoned by the local government for around about 2 or 3 years since I'd arrived, and they bought one just as I was arriving and started to operate it, but they'd never operated one before. So they went out visiting all these other play centres across the city, and then they came round, and then it was 3 o'clock, so it was time for my field work to start, so I landed up at Patchwork, and they all came in a bad mood. And it turns out that one particular play centre had rubbed them up the wrong way. And this play centre had sort of been bragging and presenting themselves as having this top-notch service delivery, and they were the de facto standard. And it was these elaborately planned evenings of activities for the young people, and lots of food that they had like an army of volunteers preparing. And we were discussing this, and then Dean just jumps up and gestures towards the front door and shouts, "That's all right for them. They have the time. As soon as that shutter goes up, we have work to do." And he's referring to the open door policy that I mentioned earlier. And it's an intrinsic part of this organisation's engagement and their accountability as lived in the moment. And it shows here that the work cannot be compared to another organisation's work without that important bit of context. Patchwork are just tailored to the needs of the community. And as soon as they open those doors, those needs are present and need to be accounted for. And these informal sessions are important not only for that sort of everyday accountability, but they also inform goals related to funding, and those funding goals will then feed onto larger projects, and there's this beautiful iterative cycle. And they also feed into the various forms of monitoring information I mentioned earlier, which now aren't actually looked at all. And whilst this work is hidden via the reporting mechanisms, it's actually obvious for those who care to look. So Mike described to me the one time that a funder actually came to visit them, and he was amazed at what the organisation did on a daily basis. And whilst that seems quite heartwarming on the surface, there was a nice funder, what I take from it is that it's incredibly difficult to account for all of this work in any formal or structural manner, because it's all based around that in-the-moment context that is not even available to anybody from the outside looking in. And as HEI researchers, I want to be quite glib and say what is to be done. Because I need that validation, I want you to go and read the paper to actually go find out about the rest. But I want to talk today about this enabling this configuration of transparency. And hopefully we can see that accountability is manifested in everyday work practice as an atmosphere and a lived pressure. On the one hand, you have this grassroots pressure from responding to beneficiaries whose needs are dynamic, they're spontaneous, they're palpable and very present. Quite irritating if you're trying to have lunch and do a workshop with some charity workers. And on the other hand, there is this pressure from above, from funders, from government, from local government, from all these other sorts of collaborative pressure groups to be accountable on their terms, on specific terms, on paper terms. And even if you do this digitally, it's still really just paper accountability. And these reports are intended to generate this accountability around spending or work, but they're incredibly rigid, and they omit a lot of context, while they actually cost the organisation quite a lot of labour. And a lot of the work of actually being accountable involves managing this conflict and how these systems are misapplied to work practices of charities. A key conflict being responding to beneficiary needs as they arise in the moment, while needing to report on particular outcomes to funders or engage in particular monitoring practices with the local government. And this is known as multiple accountability disorder, or MAD, and it's where, you as a charity, your work practice is sort of being torn apart and divided between all these different areas as you have multiple conflicting forms of accountability. And I feel that this madness is actually being reproduced by the values that have already been embedded in the systems that we impose on charities, both the digital systems like the commercial accounting software, but also the structural systems that they inhabit. And where digital technologies, I feel, and where we as HEI researchers, I feel, may play a role, is in providing workers with these toolkits to assist them in producing the accountabilities required of them with minimal impact on their labour requirements. If we really, really want to support workers, digital systems should support the production of a configurable transparency so that there exists a canonical record of work and spending, but one that can be presented in multiple forms or formats depending on the needs of the observer, but more importantly, collected and curated in multiple forms and formats and metaphors depending on the needs of the worker. So if we imagine a system which allowed workers to collaboratively engage in collecting, curating, retrieving or framing information about their practices on their own terms, and also as a byproduct satisfy the needs of others without actual much imposition on their labour. Like if the accountants demand of Mike, come on, use this expensive commercial file format, he could just hit a button and it would produce it. And the same system could be interrogated by a funder to produce a report that makes sense to them, and then Patchwork could contend it if they didn't agree with the report that was produced. Or if Dean is just down the pub and wants to show off to some of the families that he's been working with, some of the work that he's been doing with their young ones, then he can just do that. And I think if we do this, then these systems begin to address this conflict that we have inherent in this multiple accountability disorder. But I think more importantly, it addresses the issues of work practices that are being directly affected by the systems that are already there, and therefore the labour required to produce them. And I think if we embed these values of worker control and flexibility, what we end up with is an interoperable toolkit of technologies and services in those, those metaphors that everyone's familiar with now, mobile, web, apps, whatever's sexy at the minute. And then if we do that in a way that avoids a hegemonic commitment to one platform that we see in the private sector, we can actually open the door for new tools to be continually developed and sit on this federation of accountability. These new tools can present, collect, process, or use information about work and spending in new ways that I can't even conceive of yet, but more importantly, they can do that without interrupting the work practices that we want to embed in this flexible way of producing transparency and accountability. And that's all I have to say about that. I'm happy to take your questions. I'm available over email, Mastodon, which is Twitter for cool people, and Twitter.
Hello. Hi. I think this is a very interesting concept, and had a question. This might sound like a bit of a strange question, but have you looked at or thought about looking at maybe concepts in lean manufacturing or the use of Kanbans or work boards to capture some of this ad hoc work?
A lot of the actual field work involved sort of using those as sort of ways of getting people to talk about their work practice as well. They actually have a Kanban in the main office and stuff like that. But again, these formal ways that they're meant to be producing accountability don't take that into effect. I do think in this federation, I think half the battle is coming up with these metaphors that workers can sort of use to collect information about their accounts and their work practices, and then coming up with other metaphors that other people want to sort of engage with. And I foresee a future where a worker can have a Kanban or a calendar, and then a funder can look at that and understand the work practices.
Oh, sure. That's great, because they actually have open source tools that can export data that maybe they could use to pull some of that together.
Open source, good. Yeah, cool. Oh, no.
Sorry.
It's all right.
So, one thing that strikes me about this, and we've seen something very similar in Andhra Pradesh, where Maura's been spending the last 6 months, isn't it just quantification gone mad? And is there anything we can do to make more realistic? What would realistic accounting look like? And is there anything we can do to just stop adding more and more numbers onto stuff?
I think what I'm saying is we need to stop adding numbers and add more context. So I got up a few years ago and talked about qualitative accounting, but I think it's not just a way of sort of bolting on some metadata to an account and calling it less alienated. I think we need to engage in this sort of dialectic process with charities where they can produce an account, and then that can be maybe contended, or somebody else can produce an account for them, and then they can contend it and add in that sort of qualitative, that context that's important. Does that make sense? Cool.